This story has been recorded at an Addictive Eaters Anonymous meeting in New Zealand. You can email us at contact@aeanz.org.
Thanks, friend. My name's Tony. I'm an addictive eater, so good to be here. I was sort of thinking today about about the heat, and on a hot day, I would have probably just sat inside with a tub of ice cream and alcohol back in the day too, and complained and moaned. So it's nice not to have to live like that today, that the obsession to eat has been removed, but that took a long time. And I was at a meeting today and I heard somebody share that they were born an addict, and I believe that, that addiction was in me, right from the outset, from my earliest memories, and that was food. And when I was a kid growing up, I was basically all my memories were around food, and so I was the kid that was always first at the table, last to leave at birthday parties, the kid that was caught trying to fish a pie out of the rubbish bin at school, the one that the teachers always came to when the tuck shop got raided and the big ticket items were taken. I had a reputation for being an addictive eater, although that word wasn't used so much then. But my father used to call me sort of Harry Hollowlegs, and other people used to call me 10-ton Tony. And I'd like to think that was for the alliteration appeal, but in my mind I was huge, and it wasn't until years later I looked back at photos and I wasn't actually huge growing up, because I played a lot of sport, did a lot of running around, but I ate huge amounts of food and always wanted more. And right through my life, that was always the pattern, and it got worse when I hit my mid-teens and I discovered alcohol as well. So I had two things on the go, and the only curbs on my eating really were the family budget. So we didn't have a lot of money, so I didn't have a lot of money to spend over and above the food I got at home, but I was always wanting more. Like I was the type of kid that would go down to get the family fish and chips, but I could never get the packet back intact. There was always a hole in one corner, and there's always things removed. The mental obsession was there right from the start. Like I was always plotting ways of getting more food, and later on getting more alcohol. And so things changed a little bit when I left school and went away to study for my job. And in those days, they actually paid you to be a student, which was the first time I had a regular income. And that just all went on. I was always behind in my bills, like my rent and things like that, because it always went on my addiction. It always went on food, on alcohol. And if I didn't have any money for food, I went around looking for empty soft drink bottles to cash in. And I think I've shared before about the down the chicken shop where you can get 10 roast potatoes for $1. I can't remember anyone else I went to college with doing that. So my eating was always different. And in that year, I put on a lot of weight. For the first time in my life, I put on, I was genuinely overweight, 4 to 5 stone, let's say 25 kilos or something plus. And so I started to feel kind of, that self-loathing that was always there, that restlessness, irritability, discontent that talks about in the big book was always there. And I also started to get high blood pressure, so at 19 years old, 19 stone, and in my first job I had to pay a premium on my company insurance because I was deemed to be a heart attack risk. So that's where I went through the rounds of weight loss organisations, joggers clubs, gyms, trying to control it myself, trying to control that. To me it was weight, but what I always had was that obsession. I was always, thinking about food or thinking about not having food, and could not stop, could never stay stopped. And moving around a lot. I was somebody who took a lot of geographicals, went from one city to another, to one job to another, always justifying it in my mind as a promotion. But I was looking, to make a fresh start. But I was taking the problem with me, which was the disease of addiction in me. So, and to cut a long story shorter, I came back to Christchurch, and I was working on a local newspaper, and I saw a ad in our newspaper for a 12-step organisation dealing with food addiction. And in my mind, when I replied to that, I was going there for work reasons. I was going to do an article on this organisation and help them, sort of thing. But what I believe really was my higher power, sending me there, because I'd seen that ad there for quite some time before I acted on it. At that stage, I was sort of in trouble. My addiction had led me to trouble at work, trouble at home. I was sort of one step from chaos in every area of my life. And so I wrote away. We had to write away roulette to a post office box in those days, and I got a message back. Why don't you come to a meeting and find out what it's all about? So I did, but I went from the pub. So things were a wee bit foggy, but what I do remember from that first meeting was that there were people there talking about their eating openly without any real shame, very candid, honestly. A lot of them were still eating like I was, but there were a few people there who talked about being free of the obsession to eat, and I couldn't believe that. I just thought I'd be battling that all my life. So, and I'd like to say that I was so impressed that I stayed, but I didn't, because I was young, I was brash, arrogant, and I thought I could beat it. So, my way of beating it was lose weight. I basically wanted the problem to disappear, but I didn't want to give up what I was doing because, to me, I was dependent on food and other substances just to keep me level, just to keep me going. And not long after that first meeting, two people, who were getting well, came around my house and told me that if I wanted to get well, I'd have to give up eating addictively, drinking, and drugging. And I was about 24, 25 years old. I couldn't imagine the rest of my life without those things. So I said thanks, but no thanks, and then I went out and tried to solve the problem myself, which never worked. And so I thought tonight I'd talk a bit more about surrender, because for me surrender had to be giving up my old ideas, but that just took such a long time. And as I said, I was moving from place to place, job to job, and I moved to Nelson, and my drinking got so bad very quickly there that I was always drinking alcoholically, but the consequences got bad really quickly there, and I ended up in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I sat in AA for a long time, for 13 years, trying to use AA as a one-stop shop for all addiction. I knew that I had a problem with that. I knew my problem with food was as big as my problem with alcohol, but I wasn't willing to do what was suggested by those people that I met after that first meeting. And well, part of me was a little bit, because I remember writing to one of them and saying that I was in AA and that I wasn't drinking and life was better, but I just found myself eating more and more, without alcohol and without drugs. And anyway, so I got a letter back from her, and she said basically that I should come to that fellowship as well, that I, come down to Christchurch, come to some meetings, and work the principles of that fellowship. And so I was trying to be a good little AA boy at the time, so I ran it by my sponsor, AA sponsor, and he said no one ever got drunk on food, which wasn't true in my experience, looking back, but I went to him looking for that answer. I kind of know that now, and so I wrote back to this person in Christchurch, and it was quite uncanny actually because I told her what my sponsor had said, but I didn't actually name my sponsor. She wrote back to me and told me my sponsor's name. It was quite, but she would only really have met probably maybe at an area assembly or something like that, and suggested that, you know, that if I wanted to get well, I would have to give up food and all mind-altering substances. And why I know about addiction having the power to swap, when I joined AA, I knew I was beaten with alcohol. I just knew I could not drink, but my mind straight away turned to smoking marijuana again, which I'd given up because a friend got busted and ended up in court, and it was a bit embarrassing because we're both court reporters. And so I couldn't be bothered with the hassle of that. But as soon as I couldn't have alcohol, my mind turned to pot, and my sponsor said, "You can't do that, that's just swapping one addiction for another." So all I had left was the food, and I just wasn't willing to give up. I wasn't willing to let go of my old ideas. It just had to get bad enough, really. And it's amazing kind of how long it took, because I could not have wished for a better example of recovery than I got at that first meeting, and with that subsequent contact with people from that meeting. So, the disease of denial in me was such that I kind of convinced myself that I was powerless over alcohol. There had to be a power greater than me that took that desire away. But food, I had to sort that out myself, and it just never worked. I mean, I had all these sort of crazy ideas that I could just go to AA. I kind of convinced myself that because there weren't many men in this fellowship, that it was definitely a woman's disease. I mean, I remember that book, Fat as a Feminist Issue. I thought, well, yeah, it must be. I just don't believe that today. But for a long time I did. I was hanging on to those sort of things just because I was, the only reason was that I did not want to give up the food. I wanted to give up the consequences of the food, but not the actual food itself, until it got bad enough. And really, I've talked to about in the past about how I had the worst sponsor I've ever had, and for 8 years I sponsored myself in AA, and that was a disaster. And my life got more and more unmanageable in that time. It kind of looked okay from the outside. I had the same job and had a house and material things, but inside I knew that I wasn't anywhere near being rocketed into a fourth dimension of existence like I read in the big book, and like I saw in the lives of people who were coming here as well as the other fellowship. And so I ended up living on my own. Well, not living apart from my kids. Separated, having them a couple of days a week, and just eating when just eating got worse and worse. Like driving to work, kind of hungover with the food, with late for work, stop at a cafe, get some food, one hand in a bag of food, driving down the motorway, other hand on the greasy steering wheel. My home life was so unmanageable that if I needed a towel for a shower, I often had to go up to the department store in Kaiapui and buy a new one, because I wasn't doing the washing and keeping on and I was travelling a lot with work, and I ended up overseas, and something happened to me there that was entirely related to my addiction, and it cost me a lot of money to extricate myself from quite a difficult situation, and I was full of shame and remorse, and I remember sitting in my hotel room in Paris, this sort of glamorous city, just feeling absolutely lost, and thinking, and I just got this real strong feeling that you are as powerless over food as you are over alcohol. And when you get home, you need to go back to those meetings where those people have found a freedom from the obsession. And because I'd come in and out of that fellowship over the years, but I hadn't stayed. As soon as I heard something I didn't like, which was usually something as simple as, you've got to give up the food, I was off, And, but I still, I still tried to do it myself. I still had that old thinking. I knew I needed to be at the meetings, and when I got home, I went to a lot of meetings. I went to every meeting in that fellowship that there was each week, and plenty of AA as well. And what impressed me when I came back was that there were still two of those people from that very first meeting who said they'd found the freedom from the obsession. They were still here, and there were a lot more people that I'd seen getting well in the other fellowship. In fact, I remember being at a national convention for AA and seeing a whole lot of people from this fellowship arrive sort of en masse, and you could just see the recovery in them. It was just, it was quite uncanny actually. But I was eating at that time, and I just avoided them. I just didn't want to be, I just didn't want, my kind of denial to be pricked, I guess. But so, like I said, when I came back here, there were still two people from that first meeting, and there was still, then there were a lot more that I'd seen, getting well, kind of seen by the day or by the meeting and the other fellowship. So that gave me hope to come back. But I was still sort of sitting, there's a phrase in the 12 and 12 about sort of anxious apartness. And that was me for a while. I was still sort of sitting on my own, or kind of, barely talking to people sort of after meetings, and still trying to figure it out. How can I beat this? Even though I had that experience where, I guess it was, my higher power saying, you can't beat it, Tony. You're done. I was still, how do I do this? And I was at a meeting one day, a lunchtime meeting, and there was just two of us there, and the other person was quite new. And so I asked her after the meeting about, what's your food plan? And because she was quite new, I guess, and didn't know how to say, bugger off, she told me, and I went back to work and I wrote it down. And so I was trying to have her food plan, and except I was only having her breakfast and her lunch, and I was having Tony's free choice dinner. And all day I was obsessing about that. Okay, you had Chinese last night, you better have Indian tonight. You had a lot last night, but maybe it was just like a tape going in my head the whole day, and I couldn't stand it. I just could not stand it. So I found myself at the end of the next meeting going up to one of those people who had been at that first meeting. I'd heard talk about how they'd found the power greater than themselves, and they'd worked the 12 steps, and they didn't have to eat anymore. And I remember saying, how do you think it would help? How do you think it would work if I kept my main sponsor in AA? It was just a friend that I had a cup of coffee with every now and again. It wasn't sponsorship. And got a food sponsor here. And the answer I got was, knowing you, Tony, that wouldn't work at all. And so I brooded about that for another week, analysed it from every angle, and without making a decision. I can't remember ever making a decision to go and ask for help. I found myself, at that following meeting on Monday night in the old church, where the mice came out of the couch. I found myself couldn't wait for the meeting to end. And at the end of that meeting, I was straight across the room, and I asked that same person, "Will you help me?" And I heard somebody talking on Wednesday about almost being gifted that willingness to surrender, and that's my experience too. Is that I went up and asked, "Will you help me?" And the first question I was asked was, "Are you entirely ready to let go of your old ideas?" And I said, "I'm not 100% sure, but I think I am, because I can't do this." And I do believe that was sort of me showing the willingness for my higher power to decide, to use a quaint Australian expression, that I was fair dinkum about doing something different, because I was told to ring the next day at a certain time, and again the same experience. I got up early on a Saturday morning, which wasn't like me. I could not wait to make that phone call, and I was told what I needed to do around the food, around what I needed to buy to help with my food plan, what meetings I needed to go to, and what work I'd need to do on the steps. And basically I have to go back to step one, which so I found myself going, yes, yep, that's fine, yep, I can do that. And at the end of that conversation, I couldn't believe that I was saying that, because I was agreeing to do all the things that I once rejected as controls, and what I found when I started to do them, they actually turned out to be freedoms. So I know that it didn't feel like it was me doing that. It definitely felt like a surrender that I'd never experienced before. Since that day, I haven't had to eat, no matter what's happened, good or bad. And I absolutely know that's not me doing that. I still, like today, in terms of surrender, I still, anything to do with the food, I check out. I like to operate on a good day. If I have a good idea, I run that by God. If I have an absolutely great idea, I need to run that by my sponsor, because I still don't trust my thinking in a lot of areas, but I do believe that God has removed the problem in terms of eating today. I don't wake up in the morning with the desire to eat or use any other substance, and I know that's not me doing that. I could not do that. I spent 42 years trying to do that myself, and it never worked. But the trick for me is remembering that surrender is a lot more than just taking direction. It's also tapping, connecting with my higher power, like during the day, because none of us can spend the whole day on the phone to sponsors or other members of the fellowship, because we have work and whatever, daily commitments. But there are times during the day where, like it talks in the big book about, I pause in moments of indecision. Sometimes I forget to pause. I just sort of blunder on. I'd like to be more surrendered in that area, where that any time I struck that kind of indecision, I would pause, hand it over to God, and if it's still troubling me, I pick up the phone and talk about it. So I'm still on my guard about Tony's old ideas, and just lately on my kind of commute to work, I've made sure that I've listened to a speaker, an AEA speaker, an AA speaker or something, because I'd rather listen to Chuck C than Tony S. That thinking, because that's the problem. The main problem centers in the mind, and that kept me away. That kept me in that state of anxious apartness for so long. And I don't feel that today. I feel when I come here that I feel connected to AEA. I feel connected to the people here, and I feel connected to my higher power, because I love that first word of the first step. We, and the first word of the first tradition, our. And for somebody that's been a long time, trying to avoid what was on offer here, that's a gift. It's nothing I've done except get bad enough and get serious about asking for help and trying what's on offer here rather than my old ideas. So great to be here. Thanks, friend.